for a researcher, there's nothing better than seeing people run with your ideas and try to make change with it.
So there are two things that I would say at the outset. The first is that after organising for 20 years, of course your research is influenced by that work, but I don't speak today as a representative of my union, I speak as a researcher, and secondly I would say that I am a full-time official, so this represents the start of a long, sometimes very long feeling research project. That means what I present is very much emerging ideas, not findings. So that PhD thesis that I'm doing is on how unions use their power resources to regulate fissured or non-standard employment relationships. That thesis is developed from a long-delayed honours thesis and then journal article that focused on the winning work of the AWU in New South Wales in the seafood processing sector. For me, really the starting point though of all this research was a curiosity about when our unions win and when we win big. Why is that? So often when I was talking to comrades about winning campaigns, particularly where there were non-standard employment relationships, the answer for why they won was essentially this: we threw everything we had against a wall and something stuck. Sound familiar? That answer just wasn't enough for me. I wanted to know, could looking at specific wins or case studies in more critical detail give us a better guide about what we as unionists need to be doing every single day? Early on, the research confirmed, unsurprisingly, that power matters. Importantly though, getting the chance to dig into other people's research, it was really clear that there's a framework for thinking about union power in a much more structured and specific way than I'd ever had it explained to me as an organiser. That framework's up there, and it's power resources theory. The starting point for power resources theory is that unions are the primary collective actor on behalf of the working class. Sounds pretty good, right? There are essentially 5 sources of power that unions exercise in order to play that role. There is structural power that workers hold because of the location of their work in the economy. Then there is associational power that comes from organising and acting together. Unions may also have institutional power, although it ebbs and flows, from being recognised as representatives of workers in state-based tribunals and processes. Unions can also exercise ideational power by aligning their work to the meta-narratives of morality, essentially being really clear on who the goodies and the baddies are in this fight, and it is a fight for justice. There is also coalitional power that unions gain from working together with other civil society actors to build their legitimacy. In moving from asserting that unions have power to identifying the specific ways that unions use power, some of the decisions that unions make when they win start to become clearer. The first is that unions whose strategies can weather complex supply chains or gig work or any change to the familiar do this one thing. They don't immediately jump into assessing their power against the power of the employer. Instead, they start by thinking about, hey, what are our sources of power? Unknowingly analysing their 5 power resources. Then they decide which of those is the most effective way to achieve their goal. This was made really clear in the initial research that inspired this PhD. I was talking to AWU officials and delegates about their work at a seafood processing plant in the supermarket supply chain. Pretty quickly they told me that they'd identified a significant underpayment where workers were being paid ordinary rates for starting work as early as 1 AM or 2 AM. At the same time, they also identified a brilliant group of diverse and reflective workplace leaders. Whilst they were confident that they had an underpayment claim to be won, had they waited for that small win to ask the rest of the site to get involved and build their union, there would have been some pretty significant issues. The court system takes so long. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. When I first interviewed them in 2021, the hearings for that case had already occurred. At the end of 2022, they got the news that the court had awarded over $1.5 million in back pay. Pretty impressive. Pretty long time to wait. Finally, in early 2023, penalties were awarded against the company. That's a long time to wait to see the benefits of being a union member, no matter how good that underpayment figure was. Had there not been some other activity occurring at the site, those members report that they would have simply looked for other work. Particularly because, as will be no surprise to anybody here, as soon as that case was filed, the site's still unorganised at that point, the company promptly moves everyone to later start times to avoid having to pay the correct penalty rates. Given that this was a site with an unorganised workforce relying on lacklustre consultation provisions in an award that was already the subject of legal action, they really had very little power to stop it. While filing the case and exercising their institutional power, the union instead decided that the company, particularly because of its complex internal group structure, even HR subcontracted, and vulnerable workforce, many of whom were recent migrants, needed an EA that focused on a couple of things to build their associational power: delegates' rights, delegates' training, and strong consultation, so that whatever the next issue with this employer was, because there would be another issue, the workforce had the structure in place to be able to address it. After a range of workplace actions and public protests out the front of Coles and Woolworths and at the fish markets, they secured just that. The key point is that they only identified that opportunity by measuring power in terms of how their 5 buckets of power stacked up, well before thinking about how those powers interacted with what buckets of power the boss might have had. This is quite a critical change, because if they hadn't done that, really it would have been the legal case that they would have run with. While there are some other ideas emerging from the research, we've been given some very strict instructions here about how long we can take, so I'm not going to try and cover all of those today. But the thought that I did want to leave you with, particularly my fellow unionists, is how these ideas might support your own work. Many of you would be trying to turn the various legislative changes of the past year into plans for your unions. I would really encourage you to think about how these new rights work in terms of the power or lack of power that they assume. For me, the clearest example of this is the supported bargaining authorisations. These supported bargaining authorisations are arguably a legislative recognition that takes structural power from theory being presented by people like me to accepted practice. They acknowledge the lack of structural power that entrenches inequality and that placing the responsibility for fixing that on the associational capabilities of already vulnerable workers is just a really poor response to the contested powers at play. But the question for us as unionists is, will we use this tool as an opportunity to articulate a fairer vision for society? Or will the current framing of these provisions as providing a helping hand to low-paid workers continue? As though that phrase low-paid has universal meaning and exists by accident or absent a context. Adding a framework of power resources to the work that unions do provides an opportunity to really capitalise on these new legislative rights by rethinking what is available, not as a reform of a broken system, but instead as a chance to get to the heart of what we do, building power to take on the powerful. I really look forward to being able to report on more of that research as it develops.